was the sudden hiring of von Braun in 1932 and giving him technical responsibility for the Army's embryonic rocket program under a secure military environment. By 1934, the German Army was developing their first flying rocket at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground near Berlin, while German amateurs continued to work on their own projects like Gerhard Zucker's experimental mail rocket. In 1937, the Germans launched an A-3 rocket that reached an altitude of 1.5 miles and produced 3,300 pounds of thrust. Under von Braun, development proceeded smoothly at the new German rocket center at Peenemünde, where the A-4 rocket, later renamed the V-2, was being prepared for testing.
Ergebenheit! Dieses Deutschland sind gut! Wir halten Deutschland! In stolzer Freude, deine Söhne in euch!
In January 1943, there was a dramatic change. Under the pressure of military setbacks, Der Führer decided that missiles might win the war for Germany, and he gave top priority in men and material to the V-2 program. Von Braun and his team were dismayed, believing that the war would end before the rocket was ready for combat. They looked upon it as a mighty achievement on the road to the moon and planets, not as a weapon of war. Historians today consider the V-2 the direct ancestor of all modern launch vehicles. But the development of the V-2 was not without failures. As hostilities neared an end, despite it still being an experimental stage, Hitler committed the awesome V-2 to military operations. Beginning in 1944 and lasting for many months, V-2s rained destruction on targets in southeast England and recently liberated areas of Belgium. Its development was of similar magnitude to the American development of the atom bomb. By early 1945, it had become apparent that the Third Reich was in the throes of final collapse. Confusion was rampant in Germany and Peenemünde. As the Russians approached from the east, von Braun decided that he must save his rocket experts and valuable research records by surrendering to the Americans. As the Russians neared, von Braun and his fellow engineers and scientists gathered volumes of records and quantities of valuable equipment. At great risk to themselves, they made their way by truck and train past Gestapo checkpoints. And surrendered to American authorities in southern Germany in May of 1945. Von Braun and 120 colleagues began arriving at the Army's Fort Bliss in Texas in 1945. Meanwhile, parts of some 100 V-2s had been shipped to the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Operating under the code name of Paperclip, von Braun, his fellow German scientists and their families began a new life, American style. During the next 6 years, the Germans and their American colleagues refurbished and launched nearly 70 V-2s. While undertaking upper atmosphere research, one V-2 reached 114 miles altitude, and another boosted an American WAC Corporal rocket 244 miles above the Earth. Man was already probing the frontiers of space. In 1950, von Braun and his teammates left Fort Bliss and White Sands for the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. For a number of years, he served as technical director of the U.S. Army Ordnance Guided Missiles Development Group, and beginning in 1956, as Director of Development Operations Division of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. In 1960, this division was transferred to NASA, forming the nucleus of the just-created George C. Marshall Spaceflight Center. Von Braun would direct the center for another 10 years before being transferred to NASA headquarters in Washington. During the quarter century from 1945 to 1970, he and his team would write important new chapters in the history of rocketry and space travel. Von Braun had dreamt of space travel since boyhood. During the war, he managed to keep this interest alive and was once jailed by the Gestapo for neglecting his duty to develop the V-2 as a military weapon because of time he spent pondering spaceflight concepts. When he had settled in the United States after the war, he came to realize that he must sell his convictions not only to his superiors in government, but to the public as well. For the rest of his life, he would cajole, persuade, and reason with anyone and everyone on the virtues of space travel. Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories, the first science fiction magazine, was published back in 1926. It was the beginning of the popular promotion of space travel. Magazines were to become the dominant form of science fiction in the first half of the 20th century, and would prove to be an important factor in building public awareness of the promise of spaceflight. For the next 25 years, this promise drew many of the great names of science fiction: Edgar Rice Burroughs, Arthur C. Clarke, E.E. Smith, John W. Campbell, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Ben Bova, and Ray Bradbury. These are only a few of the names of the dozens of individuals who made important contributions to the promotion of space awareness. The V-2 had a tremendous effect. It took hold of the public's imagination, becoming synonymous with spaceship. It looked great, and it was a real spaceship. By the time the 1950s arrived, these dreamers, theorists, and scores of others had not only established that space travel would ultimately take place, but had anticipated virtually every step on the road to achieving it. The motion picture also played an important role in crystallizing the image of the spaceship, although its initial influence was not as great as science fiction magazines. In 1929, Fritz Lang's movie The Girl in the Moon caused a stir when it introduced the first realistic spaceship in movie history. The technical consultant was none other than the famed astronautics pioneer, Hermann Oberth. In the early 50s, realizing that popular public support was essential, von Braun began a 25-year-long public relations campaign promoting space exploration. In 1955, he appeared before the Armed Forces Staff College and stunned his audience with incredibly visionary, bold proposals for conquering space.
Guest speaker, Dr. Werner von Braun. Dr. Braun.
Gentlemen, the conquest of outer space is the greatest technological challenge of the age in which we live. The first decisive step in the conquest of space will be the placing of an object into an orbit wherein it will indefinitely circle the Earth. You see a model of a three-stage rocket on this picture. Up to this lower white line here is the first stage. It is powered by a number of rocket engines which will lift the missile off the ground until it has reached the second stage, likewise exhausted, would be dropped. Now the rocket motor in the last or top stage will take over until the final orbital speed of 18,000 miles has been reached. This speed is sufficient to keep the top stage in the orbit. Shooting people into an orbit, we have to provide ways and means of returning them safely to the surface of the Earth. Here we have replaced the top stage of the rocket by a winged airplane-type stage which would carry personnel to the orbit.
By the 1950s, it was becoming clear to some that space travel was no longer an idle futuristic concept, but actually was within reach using existing technology. This was pointed out to an astonished and fascinated American audience by von Braun himself. From 1952 to 1954, in a series of spectacularly illustrated articles in Collier's magazine, von Braun proposed an elaborate space program. From an unmanned satellite to a manned mission to Mars, every step was explained in extraordinary and convincing detail. His remarkable insight was the first to fill in the many details of the blueprint.
After dedicating most of his life to the advancement of astronautics,